Our guest this evening is John Platt. I've known John for many years. We worked together at Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. John is an attorney, and he has been an advocate for Native peoples for most of his professional career, I would say.
And some of my unprofessional
even before, unprofessionally. Yeah, he's advocated unprofessionally for Native people. So John, thanks a lot for coming here tonight.
It's a pleasure being here, David, and great you have this program, and great to see that the community public access is doing good.
Yes, well, I was fascinated to find out you helped develop the first public access station in Oregon.
One of those little project in law school.
The dark ages.
Back at the dark ages. We had Neighborhood Cable Television Center.
Nice, right up on the hill.
Project up on, right below Pill Hill. Because the problem up there was that you had, the antennas were up at the top of the hill. The neighborhood was in a shadow area, so it was cabled, totally cabled. So we were able to use the head end and set up a little studio, basically my back bedroom.
Well, you didn't have a Native Nations show, did you, back then, John?
We didn't have a Native Nations show, but we did have Ron Foss, who was Alaskan Native, who became the first intern there, and he eventually ended up working at Intertribe and doing a lot of video there as well.
Great. So where are you from originally, John? Where did you grow up?
Originally, I grew up on the East Coast, and I was in law school for a year back on the East Coast, and decided to I wanted to see what else was going on in the world.
Good idea.
And I was working at legal aid, and a girlfriend of mine from Oregon and I were going to go out to Oregon, and a fellow at legal aid said, "You ought to check out what the Indians are doing out there." This would have been 1970.
Yeah.
And we drove across the country, arrived in Tacoma, where she was going to school, picked up the newspaper. Headline said in big bold print, 55 Indians arrested for fishing. And here I was, a first-year law student, about ready to become a clerk for something that I had no idea was involved. Actually, I had some idea, because when I went to Georgetown, and I worked for Senator Mark Hatfield.
Oh.
And Senator Hatfield was a great advocate for tribes.
Yeah, he was.
Part because of his mother's work. His mother taught at the Siletz. At Siletz. She taught in the school
there. Right.
And so Senator Hatfield had, and I didn't really understand.
She kept a record of her time there teaching at Celilo.
I'd love to see that.
I've seen that.
At Siletz. Yeah.
Siletz.
I'd love to see that, because I found a picture of her with two
I'll have to
Native
I'll try
kids.
And locate that.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
And I never realized how important that was to him until later on, when I had a chance to talk to him, and how.
Oh yeah, we see a lot of pictures of him at the roundup and glad handing the tribal chiefs.
Sure, and he'd always dance. He'd always join the dances as well.
Yeah, he was a good friend of the Indian people here in Oregon.
That's right.
So you got your law degree from Georgetown.
I got an undergraduate degree from Georgetown. I went to Rutgers for 1 year, came out here, spent a year working with Billy Frank and Al Bridges and Hank Adams, Ramona Bennett at Frank's Landing. As I say, 55 Indians were arrested. They were in the Pierce County Court, and there was a lot to do for a young legal intern at the time. We had a real Native lawyer, Homer Settler. He kept all his files under his bed.
Yeah. What tribe was he from?
Homer was Yakima. He was Alvin Settler's brother, and he was not while he was working with the tribes up in Puget Sound, he was also defending Alvin in Multnomah County Court. And so I had my training with a real Indian lawyer.
Yeah, nice.
He had federal Indian law, Felix Cohen's treatise on law. He had almost every word underlined with 1, 2, or 3 lines, either a dot, a triangle, or an oblong around each word. And he knew it. He knew that book backwards and forwards.
Memorized it, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
True Indian lawyer.
I've got that book, but I've never memorized it.
So so that was quite a year.
So were you his aide during that case?
He was my mentor.
Was he defending the 55 arrestees?
No, they were all court-appointed attries who really didn't like their job very much. So we had to keep them.
No court-appointed attorney.
That's right.
Likes
So
their
we
job.
really had to keep them straight and make sure that they understood what the tribal people were trying to get across.
Yeah.
In terms of their fishing right, because they were looking for other ways of getting people off. But the tribal people were really clear after the protest that had occured on the Puyallup River. They were really clear about the need to use that case as leverage for enhancing and for really regaining their treaty rights to fish under the Medicine Creek Treaty.
Yeah, and they got support from all wide-ranging actors. And
They did. They sure
we
did.
mentioned it earlier. Dick Gregory was up there, and Marlon Brando, and it was a major event. And I remember hearing about it. I was just a kid then in John Day, Oregon, but it made the news down in John Day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So,
There was forgetting fine. I remember one day in the courtroom, all of a sudden there was a hubbub, and all the little old Indian ladies were running around and making a lot of noises and moving back and forth and whatever. And all of a sudden there was a defendant missing. And within about a half hour, he was on a plane.
They used their magic to
was on
make
a-
him disappear.
He was on well, he disappeared onto a plane going to New York City for a benefit to pay for the trials that they were doing. And it was
They
really
snuck
it was
him
quite a
out
time.
then under their dresses. or
Quite a
something.
time, but it's really heartwarming to see what's happened since the 1970s, since that period of time, because both on the Columbia and the Puget Sound, the tribes have taken over management.
Oh yeah.
And the result has been that more fish are coming back.
Well, we're co-managers. We would love to take over management.
Well, there's a lot of places where actually the tribes have taken it over. I would say in the
clearly.
Snake River, for instance, is a good example where the Nez Perce tribe has been very effective.
My tribe, the Confederate Umatillas, took over some Corps of Engineers property on the Umatilla River, or on the Columbia River, just upstream from McNary Dam. And we own it, we manage it, and it still has public access for hunters and fishers, whoever they are, as long as they're licensed. And we bought a ranch up in Elgin and redid the whole stream. It's neat tribal projects that are going on
It
right
is.
now.
It's
for
amazing. And every
improving
one of the
fish
tribes,
habitat.
whether it's in Hood River for the Warm Springs, in the Yakima or the Methow for the Yakimas,
Yeah.
the Umatilla certainly for the Umatillas, and the Snake and the Clearwater and the Salmon for the Nez Perce.
Yeah, so that big salmon war, as they called it, up in the Puyallup River, Frank's Landing, after that came out, I mean, that sort of initiated the U.S. versus Oregon, the big case, the Bolt decision, that gave us a 50% allocation of the salmon. It kind of built from that event.
Well,
the
actually,
salmon
they were
wars.
both at the same time. Both the Columbia River salmon wars were going on at the same time
Salmon
as Puget
scam.
Sound.
I call that the salmon scam.
Salmon scam. Well, that's
Salmon
another.
wars
We'll
up
get on
there.
to that too.
Salmon scam.
That's right. And you had
It was a scam.
two judges who really started to really understand what the treaties were about and became.
Yeah.
They took a very strong stand about the injustice that had occurred. That's Judge Bologna and Judge Bolt. And their decisions were playing off of each other at the same time. In the US v Washington case, when I was on as a consultant to what was the California Rural Legal Services that became the Native American Rights Fund, and was asked to basically collect documents that were to be used for US v Washington at that time, which included certified treaty maps, for instance, from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and others. And at that same time, So Happy v. Smith, which is the case that was initiated by Indian fishermen, the river people, that case was starting to move into federal. It was becoming a federal case. And Sid Lezak, who was the U.S. attorney down here, put the U.S. in United States versus Oregon. So you had U.S. v. Oregon, U.S. v. Washington playing back and forth with decisions coming down from each judge. And those decisions really furnished a platform from which the tribes, they furnished a scaffold from which the tribes could
Very
continue.
good, yes.
But it was and in fact, the United States versus Oregon case is the longest standing case on the federal court docket. And it's
Really?
still, the court still exercises jurisdiction on it over at U.S. v. Oregon, and it is the longest U.S. court docket.
This the Snake River, Lower Snake River dams, and the EIS that the local judge is doing has been going on for 15, 20 years now, hasn't it?
But it doesn't quite measure up to the
Oh,
big
no.
one,
No.
the U.S. v. Oregon.
But this one could actually have an end. This case, it could end, and a decision could be made.
At some point or another. But it's
But U.S. v. Oregon will continue, won't it? Won't it stay open?
because it's staying open in order to ensure that that the parties, the state and the federal parties, are following the dictates of the law. Because when Senator Slade Gorton, who was the former Attorney General in the state of Washington,
Can I hiss?
yeah, a little bit. We can hear it from the audience, I think, out there as well. Slade Gorton had demonstrated to the court pretty clearly that there was a failure of justice. There was a real injustice that was being committed against the tribes by government. And some of the historical work that I did demonstrated that that was really a theme that ran through the history of treaty rights and treaty fishing rights, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where the states and the feds were constantly trying to figure out ways to keep the Indians from fishing. And but they didn't succeed. And that's, I think, the part of the story. And as a result, the tribes came closer together in terms of actually exercising management over those runs. In 1947, the effort on the part of the state and federal fishery agencies was to no longer manage fish in the upper river, was instead to consign the upper river to industrial development. In fact, it's curious that you had the state and the federal fishery agencies saying, we'll never have fish up there with those dams, we'll never have fish up there with those dams. And you had the federal water management agency said, oh yeah, you could have fish with those dams. Well, finally a deal was made, and the deal was that the federal and state fishery agencies would support the Snake River dams, provided that Congress would appropriate, with support from the water management agencies, Congress would appropriate monies for hatcheries in the lower river that would supply the sports fisheries and the lower river gillnet fisheries and the troll fisheries. So basically the state and federal agencies, the fishery agencies, said, we don't care about the upper river, which is really ironic.
So that was the Mitchell Act?
That was actually, the Mitchell Act was the funding vehicle
For the hatcheries?
But you actually, what you had was an agreement that was called the Lower Columbia River Development Project, and that Lower Columbia River Development Project was aimed towards building those hatcheries in the lower river. And actually, the context. Let me give you a little context on it. In 1947, spring of 47, the Department of Interior said, we need a 10-year moratorium on dam building. We have two problems, fish and Indians. We have to deal with them. So give us a moratorium. That went before a committee called the Columbia Basin Interagency Committee, a committee that was composed of the departments, these are federal departments of War, Commerce, Interior, Agriculture, and the Federal Power Commission, and the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Fairly powerful committee. They held a hearing in Walla Walla in the 26th and 27th of June, and the question was whether or not to support the moratorium. A couple of months later, they made a decision, October 8th, 1947, and their decision was, one, we'll expedite the dams, we'll expedite the Snake River dams, we'll expedite the Dalles Dam. Secondly, we're going to move the fish from the upper river to the lower river. We'll get appropriations for these state agencies, Oregon and Washington particularly, to build hatcheries down there. And thirdly, we'll compensate the Indians for their treaty rights. And that decision was made by the state and federal agencies, and I would argue that they still have, to some extent, the inertia that came from those decisions. But the Indian fishermen didn't catch that. They didn't quite hear that that decision had been made. And pretty soon after, for instance, after Celilo, they were out fishing again, and they were fishing above their sites instead of on their sites. It was quite a. I mean, it was a clear. Well, part of the reason for this decision was that in 1942, the United States Supreme Court came down with the Tooley decision, and Thule v. Washington. And Thule v. Washington, a Yakima fisherman, refused to get a license, basically. And that decision said to those state agencies, you don't have jurisdiction over the tribes fishing at Celilo. And so at that time, the agencies became pretty clear, without jurisdiction, they would just as soon not have the Indians fishing at Celilo. And that hearing really gave pretty clear voice to that. Actually, it gave, ironically and interestingly, Milo Moore, who was the Washington Department of Fisheries director, he was at the hearing. He asked to be off the record. Well, the stenographer didn't hear him, I guess, because someone kept typing. And what he said was, we have this decision from the United States Supreme Court. We're not able to exercise jurisdiction at Celilo. We feel that maybe we don't need Celilo any longer, or the Upper River fishery. And the result was that an agreement was made before the hearing. The agreement was that the state and federal fishery agencies and other interests would support the Snake River dams. These are fishery agencies and interests, and the interests were Isaac Walton Lake particularly. They would support those interests if they were to receive appropriations. 1947, at the beginning of 1947, the appropriation for hatcheries was going to be $100,000, and with the committee saying that you guys ought to start paying for that yourself. The following year, $12 million was on the line for appropriations, and that was because of that agreement that was made by the state and federal fishery agencies.
So you're telling me that a federal agency made a decision before they held the hearing? The first time that's ever happened,
believe
right?
that? And actually, that was the day before the hearing. The memo was dated the day before the hearing that said that the fishery interests are willing to support, or the fishery interests recognize the need for these dams. But we want to go forward with the Lower Columbia River Development Project. Now, the result of that was that there were many hatcheries built in the Lower River that were fished to meet their abundance. Well, the problem was that you had wild fish that were running at the same time, mixed stock fisheries, that were being fished at a harvest rate that was far beyond what they could sustain.
Oh, yeah.
So you actually had an effort through those regulations to eliminate those fisheries. Now, those now are under the jurisdiction of Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is being managed by the Department of Commerce through the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA Fisheries. NOAA Fisheries. Yeah. And that's the successor to the agencies that took that action to eliminate those fisheries back in, or those fish resources back in the 1940s.
Yeah, well, I've told my audience before that the state of Oregon had a policy in black and white to eliminate the tribal fishery from the state of Oregon. And I guess it was removed in 38 or somewhere around there, but it was still kind of in the dark realm, as they call it these days.
Well, once they failed to, once the tribal fishermen went back out to take these fish, the numbers were going down. Then they were finding that they weren't eliminating the tribal fishery, that the runs were continuing, and although at very diminished levels. And so at that point, then they took action, the salmon scam action, basically surveillance that lasted for about a year, actually a year of surveillance that resulted in the arrests and imprisonment of a number of Indian fishermen. And that salmon scam, when I reviewed what salmon scam consisted of, to a great extent it was a propaganda effort. It was a propaganda effort that began in 1981, late 1981, and really didn't end until 87 or 88, when you had a couple of journalists, Linda Baker and Jeannie Senior, Oregonian in the Journal here in Portland. And you also had Senator Inouye and Senator Dan Evans, both of whom came to advocate for David So Happy. But it was from that period, from the very beginning of that effort, press release after press release, constantly accusing the tribal people of poaching, saying that they had, in fact, in one case, it was 40,000 fish that were supposedly taken. Now, once the...
How big was the run that year?
Big truck. Took a big truck.
All the fish that came out.
But the 40,000 fish that they were talking about that had not made it for between the
From
Dalles,
Bonneville to the Dalles.
That's right. The problem that they had was that there was an aluminum plant emitting fluorides, and that the fish were not spawning, or that they were spawning ahead. They were staying away from that plume, and so they weren't found. Now, the National Marine Fisheries Service didn't announce that until about a week or two after the trials had taken place, that they had found this. Up until that time, the people at Cook's and Cook's and at Celilo, they were supposedly responsible for poaching 40,000 fish.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of propaganda that went on continually. And I think it was definitely, it seemed to have been an effort to really create anger among sports fisheries and others about the tribal fishery.
Oh yeah, and it succeeded. I mean, when I first started getting involved in the fisheries as an activist, a political activist in the early 80s, sport fishermen were just dead set against any tribal fishery, and they didn't want to work with tribes, and it was maybe one or two people would, think, oh, maybe Bill Bakke, one person who actually approached me and said, I liked what you said about your treaty right to fish, and then Bill Bakke kind of turned against the tribes more recently with his wild trout initiative, or, for instance,
genetic purity. It's
we
a
were
genetic
trying,
purity effort.
we were trying to outplant Chinook salmon on the Umatilla River, which had gone extinct back in the 30s, and it was a success. We brought Chinook salmon back to the Umatilla River. Oh, according to the Wild Salmon Institute, or whatever they call themselves, you just destroyed the purity of the run that was non-existent there.
No, from what I've seen, and I have a website, Columbia River Salmon, Bring 'em Back Wild. And from what I've seen is that there's a tremendous amount of appreciation by sports fishermen, particularly on the east side.
Oh yeah.
On the west side, my own observation has been that it's a different kind of a sports fisher. The sports fishers on the east side tend to be more interested in having a fish on the table, rather than playing with their food, as it were. And I appreciate the fact that being in the wild and having a fish on a line and dealing with that fish, that's an experience in itself. But on the east side, it tends to be there's more of an interest in fish that you can take home and bring to the family and have for a dinner. Mm. And I think the people on the east side are particularly are much more appreciative of what the tribes are doing. I find that over and over and over responses I get to the website, or the Facebook page.
When I was at the Sportsman Show last week, every 10 or 15 minutes somebody would come by and say, oh, you're with Critfic? Gee, thanks for all the work you guys are doing getting fish back in the river. And, I know the tribes have really been doing a lot of work. And some of them would just go on how appreciative they were of the work that the tribe is doing. And that's the finish to my story, because those sport fishermen have come around now to where a lot of times they support the tribal fishery and they know what we're doing out there, so they really appreciate it.
Well, the success stories, you have a success story in the Snake River that's amazing. 78 fish came across the dam in the Snake River in 1990. They've been going at 20 and 30,000 adult wild fish. And the reason that happened was because the Nez Perce tribe set up a program of outplanting Snake River fall Chinook into the wild. That program came about when Senator Hatfield, again Mark Hatfield, said, I want to put $5 million into the tribal fishery. And Silas Whitman and the Fisheries Department at Nez Perce took it as a challenge, and they brought those fish back. And initially, the Department of Commerce, in its management of endangered species, said, well, when we have 2,500 fish, we'll consider them recovered. Well, then it became 25,000 fish.
Yeah.
And there's still no recovery because they're saying, well, unless you can demonstrate that those fish are sustainable, there's no recovery. Well, unless the Snake River dams are taken out, they're not going to be sustainable. But in the meantime, what are you going to do? Keep them under National Marine Fisheries Service rules and regulations. Well, in the fall, with fall Chinook, it isn't as difficult as it is with spring Chinook because they're talking about very tight rules about genetic purity, the kind of genetic that you may weaken the fish if you somehow or another introduce a fish that may have been in a hatchery for part of its life
or something.
They become lazy fish. That's right.
But hatcheries are evolving practices, especially with the Nimipu. They're really more natural environment, and the predators have their chance to come and scare them, and the hatchery management's getting better.
Yeah, it really is. I think part of it has been that the word hatchery has become a bad word. And a friend of mine we were talking about it as we had left the Umatilla project actually, and saying there's got to be some other way of putting this. Supplementation, hatcheries, these words they're too heavy. What about wild salmon nursery? Because that's really what the tribes are doing, is that they're stewarding wild salmon by giving them increased survival at their earliest life stage.
I like
because
that.
if the dams are taking 90% of the if habitat predation and whatever is taking 90% in the gravel, and then the dams are taking them, well, how can you increase that survival in the habitat at least, so that 95% of the fish make it to leave? And that's a stewardship that the tribes are practicing. And it isn't the only area, as you know, eagles, wolves, over and over, tribes are bringing the animals back that have been hurt by development.
Yeah, and while you use that word stewardship, we want to show our audience a clip of some really good stewards. If you're familiar with the Surfrider Foundation, you know that the surfers got tired of dealing with the pollution that they were surfing through. They're in the environment. They see the effects of pollution. They got organized and started doing this cleanup program that has gone all over the world now. Surfrider is a major project. And there was offshore drilling, of course. We talked about this on the last show. There have been proposals to do some offshore drilling right here in the good old state of Oregon. But there's a lot of people that will be fighting that. And what we have this clip is from the event that was held last weekend down in Salem at the Capitol building to protest the offshore drilling, which, it may happen, but we're working to hope that it doesn't happen. So there were some Native people that spoke at this event, and we'd like to bring them to you. So take it away back there in the booth, and we'll bring you a scene from the Surfrider event in Salem.
When it comes to protecting Oregon's coast, we're a bipartisan state. In the same fashion that Oregonians have come together and bound together in support of public beaches, in support of a bottle bill, the first in the country, we are united in understanding the threats that offshore oil drilling poses to our way of life, our jobs, and our coastal economy. We will not gamble our ocean resources with dangerous oil exploration and polluting drilling activities and exploration that put our future and that of future generations at risk. And I'd like to say a few words on behalf of the recreational community, those folks that enjoy the coast, to walk on the beach, to go surfing, photography, for wildlife viewing, for tide pooling. We cannot imagine an Oregon coast with offshore oil drilling. As we heard from Senator Roeblen, at Christmas time we see crab boats on the horizon. I'd like to continue seeing crab boats on the horizon, not oil platforms on the horizon.
Yeah!
Now, you probably heard some numbers tossed around about Oregon's ocean economy, and the National Ocean Economics Report and Program reports about $2.5 billion annually that's invested or is market of our ocean. That's a pretty shy number for what is actually realistic for our coast. When I look at recreation alone, in 2011, the Surfrider Foundation conducted a study on non-consumptive recreation, people that just enjoy the beach, enjoy surfing, tide pooling, as I mentioned before. $2.4 billion in annual expenditures.
Yeah.
That is an economy we cannot risk with offshore oil drilling, and we will not accept that off of our coast. In a moment here, we're going to hear from our state treasurer, Tobias Reed, who's going to speak a little bit more to the economy, the important economy of the Oregon coast, and that of our future generations, and what's important to us here. We see a renewable future in Oregon. We do not see stronger dependence on fossil fuels. It's dinosaur energy, and we are not living in the dinosaur age.
And I want to just take a minute to introduce the next speakers. Elk and Alicia Littleleaf are good friends from the Warm Springs tribe. They're a husband and wife fly fishing guides, experts on landing salmon and steelhead and rainbow trout on the Deschutes River. They came all the way over from the Warm Springs tribe. These are the Littleleaf guides. They know what they're doing. They have a true passion and love for the earth, Mother Earth, and all that it provides to their community as well as ours. Let's welcome the Littleleafs, please.
My name is Alicia Littleleaf. This is my husband Elkie. We are Warm Springs and Wasco descendants from the Warm Springs tribe. And we are originally from the mouth of the Columbia, the Astoria and the Chinookan area. That's where our people descend from. So that's why we are here. We are here to speak on the behalf of our natural resources. That is the salmon, the steelhead, the lamprey, eel. I can go on. The huckleberries, the roots, there's so many natural resources that are involved, and it would be a domino effect if there was to be any drilling and oil effect. We already know there's too many risks involved, and we're here to speak on behalf of those natural resources that can't speak for themselves. And we're also here to keep the movement alive. Water is life, because without water there is no life, and that water has to be kept clean and pure and cool. And as Bob said, that we are from the Columbia River, but we're also from the Deschutes. That's where we reside now. That's where our livelihood is. So we still depend on these natural resources. It is our livelihood. We fish for these salmon, these trout, this steelhead, and it provides for our family, and it's supposed to be for future generations to come, not just for the next generation or the next after that. It's supposed to be for 7 times that and more. And I'll let my husband speak, but this is for all of us, for not just the indigenous, but for all of us, and we have to continue to work with our allies and to continue to amplify our voice, and to continue to keep getting right done and do right by our natural resources, our Mother Earth, our Nichi Wanapum, that is the Columbia River. We're Columbia River people. Water is life.
I'm upset for coming out here. I'm upset that I have to keep standing up, fighting for our resources and speaking up. I'm upset for seeing all these foreign companies that are coming here, taking advantage of our resources for a profit. And these people that are trying to take over our resources, that are trying to drill in our coastlines and for a profit, do not realize the endangerments that are happening to our society, that's happening to our natural wildlife, our orcas, our killer whales, our sea lions that are coming up the river. All these are man-made problems, and they're here for a reason. And these people can't see that, so we have to step up as citizens in Oregon, as natives. We all have to unite and step up to these people and let them know that we want to keep our coastlines clean and pure as it should be, because we all live it. Our 1855 treaty, that's our agreement to keep all of our land sacred as it should be, because if anything out on that ocean coast destroys any of those rivers that are coming in, that's going to affect our way of life, and we've been dependent on that for thousands of years. And I'm upset for this happening. That's happening. We need to end this now. Step together. No oil on our coast.
And I just have to state that we do this as a fishing guide service, but as tribal members, as concerned tribal members, we've opposed no coal, we've opposed no Nestle, we oppose no oil, we oppose no oil transferred by railway. There are so many things that you could be involved. You can get online and you can look up all these different hashtags, hashtag no Nestle, no coal, no oil. And you can find out what those all mean by just simply clicking on those hashtags. Those are keywords that are very important that we use on social media on a daily basis. We're almost crying and trying to open eyes all the time and trying to get more people to come and join our battle with us. So right now I'd like to take this time and introduce our tribal council lady. Her name is Karina Miller, and she has been involved with us, and she has went down to Standing Rock with us in our canoe family.
Karina Miller. I'm very thankful to be here today. I'm very thankful you are all here today, that we're all here together standing against this. All right. For the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and the Native people of Middle Oregon since time immemorial, all that was needed to survive was provided by nature. Roots and berries came from the earth, which also sustained deer, elk, and other wildlife, and the water has provided salmon and eels. Waikunush is the Ichishkeen word for salmon. For tribal people in Oregon, salmon is and always has been a central part of our lives and our culture. As a tribal leader, part of my responsibility is to speak for the things that cannot speak for themselves, to think ahead 7 generations and make decisions that will impact their success or their struggles. Our salmon spend at least a year in the ocean before returning to their home rivers and streams to spawn. They survive predators, ocean conditions, and commercial harvests, and may swim hundreds of or even thousands of miles to get back to the stream where they hatched. But only a small percentage of the salmon make it home. Endangering this cycle of life further by allowing oil and gas drilling and transport which threatened ocean habitat cannot be allowed. It is not only the life of the salmon at risk, but loss of first foods that sustained our ancestors and that connects us to them now. In addition to our historic and spiritual relationships with these fish and its obvious negative impact on marine life, offshore drilling for oil and gas will have negative impact on coastal commerce, tourism, recreation, fishing, navigation, marine transport, public access, and abundant marine life. Oil and gas lease sales off the Pacific coast, drilling and transportation of oil and gas are not in the best interest of our economies, our environment, or our people. I want to say thank you to all the elected officials who have taken a strong stance against this, who are here today making statements against this, who are in DC making statements against this, tribal elected officials across the country making statements against things like this. Now, I'm really thankful for these rallies. I'm really thankful for these issues that are finally bringing communities together that haven't traditionally been allies. Tribes have had a hard time with colonization. Chush, Iwa, Wikishwit. That means water is life. Chush, Iwa, Wikishwit. Let's chant it 5 times. You ready? So they can hear. You ready? Chush, Iwa, Wikishwit. Chush, Iwa, Wikishwit.
Well, that was good to see Karina Miller. Her dad, Ken Mann, and I are good friends, and hoping the best for Ken Mann. He recently suffered renal failure and is on dialysis, and he's lost a lot of weight, so hang in there, Ken Mann. We're hoping the best for you. But it was good to hear those words from those native people, the Warm Springs tribal members, and the oil drilling is kind of taking a back seat. It seems like with the Trump administration, something else comes up that you get distracted by, right. And then when you're trying to concentrate on this, something else comes up to get distracted by. It's been a very wild year and month with this administration.
It seemed to me that it was that the Reagan administration attempted to do the same thing. And Wilfred Yallop, who was the chairman of the Yakima Nation for some time, a tribal leader, spiritual leader at Yakima, I had the real pleasure and honor of accompanying him to a meeting on the Oregon coast. And he gave a good talk, and then all of a sudden he said, it's like they're putting a hypodermic needle in Mother Earth. And it was just, people just started tearing up, starting to think about what he was saying, is that to pull those resources out when there's so many resources that are going to be affected.
Yeah.
It was very important. And it was stopped at that time by the states that had coastlines that they treasured. Oregon was one of them. Florida is not very interested in seeing oil as well, so hopefully that isn't going to go anywhere. But
Well, they already conceded that they wouldn't drill off the Florida coast.
Right.
Florida's got enough political clout that they can tell them how it's going to be over there. But here on the West Coast,
we don't need the oil from Florida.
Since we voted Democratic in this area, I think that might have an effect on why we're getting that, what they're trying to do now. So, John, we've talked a lot about history, and we need to come up to what are you doing now? What is the latest for you, John?
Well, I had the great honor and privilege of going through a lot of the archives of Columbia River Intertribe and putting them in the context of the previous history, the history that went into U.S. v. Oregon and U.S. v. Washington, the history that went into that decision that was made to move all the fish production, to not manage the upper river and move it into the... And it's been fascinating to see the way the tribes developed their management efforts, not only at Intertribal Fish Commission, which really is a technical arm and a management coordination arm, but the tribal programs themselves have been amazing in the way that they've taken advantage of every opportunity to rebuild naturally spawning runs in the river through the use of wild salmon nursery techniques. And those techniques are working. They're working. There's still bugs to be worked out, but there was a long-term decline that occurred to the 78 fish when there had been 30 to 50, when there'd be 400 to 500,000 Snake River Falls Chinook, down to 78 fish. The tribes are bringing them back, and you're seeing that all over the upper river. And there was, but I think people have to understand that there was a conscious decision to eliminate those fish in the upper river, and there's a conscious decision on the part of the tribes to bring them back, and it's working. And to understand that, to be able to support that, I think it's important to understand the history. And so a lot of the work I'm doing now is pulling that history together in two developments. One is a website called LastTruth.org. And that Last Truth came from a quote that Henry Charlie made at that hearing in 1947. The tribal people were sort of, you could see they were sitting by themselves because this deal had been made around them, all right? And he said to the Corps of Engineers and to this Columbia Basin Interagency Committee, other peoples come to Celilo, get the fish to eat. White people in English, they live on that last truth we got. Preservation, Isaac Stevens, the governor who did the treaties, preservation, he says, I will protect you from white people. Where is it? Where's the buffalo? Where's the deer? Where's the elk? Where's the moose? Conservation took it all away. And today we are on the last truth we got, fish. I found that a fascinating quote for a lot of reasons, but one of them was conservation took it all away. Wise use, right? Conservation, you said you would preserve our way of life. Conservation took away our resources, and I think that conservationists, environmentalists, need to take a really close look at what conservation means in terms of government policy, because it means something very different to tribal people, as Henry Charlie said, and wise use and conservation. One of the things I was surprised at early on, and I've become to really accept it because I think it's very true that the tribes see that the treaty right extends not only to the tribal people but to the coyote and the eagle and the hawk and all of the other animals, and that is the tribal way of rebuilding those runs is aimed at rebuilding ecosystems.
The system, yeah.
And allowing the system to flourish, because if the system flourishes, then the salmon can flourish. And if the salmon don't flourish, the system will die. And a lot of the technical efforts that have been undertaken by the non-Indian agencies have been compromised by the technical aspect of it. There wasn't close listening and seeing and observing of what the animals, how the animals interacted. And I've been troubled by conservation biology in that sense, because conservation biology, some of the conservation biologist people who should really have understood that were some of the strongest opponents of what the tribes were doing in terms of rebuilding naturally spawning runs, stewarding those resources.
Yeah, that's odd.
Yeah, it is, but the tribes have a different view of it, and that's one of the real honors of my life and privileges of my life has been to see that, to really have a close look at that different view. Conservation took it all away, but the tribes are bringing it back.
Yeah, well, it's grounded in our religion, John. We have laws that we have to live by, and water is our first law. If you can imagine that as a law, water, clean, cold, clear water, is what we cherish the most. It was like, compared to how a woman loves diamonds, or how a gold miner would want gold. We were after that cold, clear, clean water. We still are. And the salmon, which is another one of our laws, they are so closely tied to the water that they are not independent of each other. They totally rely on each other. The water relies on the salmon relies on the water, and it's all a part of the system. So when you understand Native religion, you can see how words like symbiosis, I don't know if we had an Indian word for symbiosis, but clearly that was our way of life, to be a part of the system, to blend into the system, to know when this was happening at this area, and then you would go to here to harvest this and move to this area for another harvest. So we were in tune to all the rhythms and the functions of nature, and our people were expert botanists. I know my grandma could identify hundreds of plants, and she knew how to prepare them and how to, if they were medicine or food. So the salmon are our law, but the roots and the berries are also a part of that law that we live by, and we have a symbiotic relationship where we know not to take too much of what we're utilizing and leave some for later. And there are kind of four tenets of our religion: the water, the salmon, the roots and berries, and the meat. And because we knew we were dependent on these for our very survival, they had a priority in our life, because we knew we would have that for the future generations. And we really need to bring that intent back to society, where you know that society or government has its role to take care of us as through their own methods, but it's nature and her bounty that really provides all of our needs that we were able to survive on for thousands of years here in Oregon. And
that's the key. That to me is the key, and that's the patient observation that went on over thousands of years. Non-Indian European people have been here for 200 years, and tribal people over 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 100,000 years, however many it was. And simply because there's physical evidence found 13,000 years ago doesn't mean that that's where it stops. But for that amount of time to be able to observe those connections, especially when those connections were fundamental to how one lived, really made the difference. And if that's why I say co-management, that the tribes are managing these resources. The states are there to have their role and to play their role and to basically exercise some let's say they're at the table, but now the tables have turned so that we have people like well, Steve Wright, the Bonneville Power Administrator, who could have been had been a problem with tribes for many years, he finally figured it out. And at a Portland State University class that he and I taught,
Really?
he said, the reason that I made an agreement with the tribes to rebuild these runs was because the tribes were the only ones who could do it. Now, he made sure that there were no tape recorders going at that time. but he said that the reason that he made an agreement with tribes to rebuild those runs was because he had watched the state and federal agencies doing it, and they had not done it in a way that was satisfying what he believed to be the need. And he kind of got religion about it.
Nice.
And I think part of that became from being at Celilo for a couple of days when we were memorializing the loss of Celilo Falls.
I was there.
Remember, and Steve was there with his son, and he sort of, as I say, got religion. And I guess I'm not using the term lightly when I say that, because he really did. He had a whole different view at a certain point. And more people need to take a look at what the tribes are doing and learn from those from that many thousands of years of being in the Pacific Northwest on these lands, to understand that observation is the most valuable observations we can have.
So what we're seeing now in our observation is a lot of different grasses impeding on our native plants, our roots, and it's a real invasive species is a real problem affecting our roots. And the forest management, too, impacts the berries. Huckleberries are often found on national forest lands.
Sure.
So the Forest Service is part manager of that resource, if you want to call it that. It's our native food. And so huckleberries have to have clearings, which would often be brought on by fires, which were a natural part of the system. And we actually relied on fire back in the day to keep our lands healthy. But nowadays, the fire policy is really messing with nature, and that's a whole other discussion for another time.
Actually, the Willamette Valley, the Atfalati people, the Northern Kalapuya people, used fire in August or so to roast their acorns and their hazelnuts. And they were pyroculturists, some of the original pyroculturists, but those they suffered the malaria and smallpox epidemics of the turn 1793, 1803, and weren't able to really make their identity known.
Yeah.
They were assimilated more quickly.
Yeah, they lost most of their culture. Fortunately, the Cayuse people were able to maintain a lot of their culture over the years. Which brings us to my book review. I almost forgot to do a book review tonight because the conversation was going so well. But you guys know that I'm an avid reader, and I've read this book a couple times, not recently. But when I was looking for a book to review, I thought, well, geez, my dad had two grandfathers, and they were both Cayuse. One of his grandmas was Umatilla and Nez Perce, and the other one was Walla Walla. So the Cayuse people are our people. And this book is done by a couple non-Indians, but Ruby and Brown were real avid anthropologists, I guess, or they loved to study native people and native culture. They had big collections of arrowheads and other artifacts, and they wrote a lot about not only the Cayuse but other tribes in the region. They have three different books out, Ruby and Brown. But I have the commemorative issue here, which came out just recently because there was a call for more issues of this to come out, so they reprinted it, and my sister gave me this copy. But this does a pretty good job of talking about the history of the Cayuse people after contact. It really relies on a lot of written documentation, their sources, and they do some personal interviews, not enough, but they did try to get some firsthand information from tribal members from the Cayuse, so that's a good sign when you do that. I really liked this book because it talked about my people and what they were doing the last 150 years or so. I learned a lot about some family members that were mentioned in here. So this is a book for anybody who wants to know about the Cayuse people. And it's more probably an academic level, high school or college level. I wouldn't give it to a middle schooler, or they wouldn't be interested. But it does a good documentation of Cayuse history. And if you want to know more, go up to the reservation and talk to somebody.
Visit
You'll learn
Temastlik,
a lot.
too.
The Temastlik Cultural Institute, another great place to go. Yes, our reservation has a development thanks to the casino, the first business that we ever made a profit on as a tribe. And it helped us develop a golf course and the Temastlik Cultural Institute, which is run by Bobby Connor. And she does a great job of bringing wonderful displays in. Right now they've got a display of, they had an art contest for native artists in the community, and they're on display, all the native art there at Temastlik. So next time you're up on the Umatilla Res, drop some quarters in the machine and go out to Temastlik and check out their latest displays. And they have permanent displays which talks about our culture and shows a bunch of cultural items, artifacts, clothes, horse trappings, and you learn all about the Cayuse people there too. So John, we're running out of time.
It's been a pleasure, Dave.
I'm really glad you came to give us some history about the tribal fishery, and thanks for being such a big part of it for all these years. And as a way to show my appreciation, I want to give you this blanket right here.
You got to be kidding. No.
Right now. This is your
good.
blanket.
Well, I'll have to stand for that. Yeah. Well, thank
In
you.
appreciation for all your years of service to Indian people, and use
There
it
we
to
go.
keep warm.
Oh, I love it.
Or whatever.
This is fantastic, David. Thank you
Well deserved.
so much. Well, this is far beyond any. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
And it's nice to know about your confederated family there, the Cayuse Yumawa.
Kayumawa, we call
Yeah, that's
ourselves.
right.
That's right. So thank you all for watching. We'll be back next month on the third Thursday of March, just before I take my vacation to the Bay Area. And I don't have a guest for next month, but we'll plan on it. We'll see you again. Thanks for watching.